In the previous episode, after my confession, my mother forgave my sisters and William, and I was told to say goodbye to my home. Of course, I was ready for it, but it turned out that saying goodbye was much more painful than I thought. Hello, everybody. You should watch the previous episodes if you haven't already done so. And my name's Emma, and my days in the Smiths family are over. Or aren't they? We drove for a long time, but I didn't notice, because tears were pouring down my cheeks without stopping. Because of stupid tears, I couldn't even see the road, and I certainly didn't follow the time. I just knew that sooner or later the car would stop, and my happy life would finally end. But still, it was a little strange that we were driving for so long. Yes, my boarding school was in the countryside and quite far from the Smith's house, but not on the other side of the state. I just couldn't ask why. My throat was suffocated with spasms, so there were only some stupid sobs instead of clear speech. And then the car stopped, and I woke up from my self-pity immediately, because there was something outside the window. To be honest, I didn't know at all what was outside, but the beautiful glass building clearly didn't look like a boarding school. It was more like an expensive office or something like that. I looked at my mother. She made a strange hand gesture, like clean up and come out already. I nodded and opened the glove compartment to get some napkins. We came out in front of this strange building, and Mom stepped forward in silence. I followed her like I was tied to her. I was silent too, but I constantly looked around because there was a lot to look at. The building was fully made of glass and it was very high. It had no less than 60 floors. And if you looked closely, you could see people running and fussing in every window, like an anthill in the maximum approximation. Inside too, everything was expensive and stylish. Black reception desks, marble floors, and the elevator which was finished with gold panels. In fact, rather painted, but it looked epic. We got out on the 20th floor. Mom waved at someone, shouted something deep into the long corridor, and turned towards the big oak door right in the center. I had already understood that for some reason, I was honored to visit her Holy of Holies, the office where my mother made money and ran her own large corporation. But what for? To show me what I had lost? Well, probably. She didn't think about anything like that. She just dropped in before taking me back to the boarding school. My mother looked around in the office, took out some big box and put it in front of me, and she sat down at the table and immersed herself into the papers. I sat down on the edge of a chair and looked around. In fact, my mother's office was no different from the same one in the Smith's house. Well, maybe it was a bit larger, but still, there were the same strict lines. A lot of metal and catalogs with folders all over the wall. There were papers in the box as well. I looked at them outside of the corner of my eye, but I didn't understand anything. Besides, the behavior rules had not yet been canceled, and I was polite enough not to check out the contents of the box. It turned out that I did so in vain, for when my mother was distracted from her work, she asked me why I was sitting with such a sad face and doing nothing. After all, she had clearly showed me the scope of work. I had to look through, sort, and study everything that was in the box. I looked at her like an owl, with big round eyes. My mother looked at me and laughed. Not mockingly. There was an absolutely ordinary, warm mother's laugh. And then she came up to me and gave me a hug. And then we had another time of revelations. But this time, it was not me who spoke, but her. And she told me something that I had never even thought about. It turned out that my mother had known at first sight what I was like. And, of course, she knew that she would have problems with my upbringing. But she decided to try, and as a result, she only had to watch me hissing, spitting, trying to intrigue, but at the same time gradually losing ground. She also guessed about my affair with my sisters and brother at once, but she didn't interfere, because it was a lesson not just for him. It was high time for William to learn to defend his opinion. The girls really grew up too pampered and deedless, and there was prepared a very special place for me in the family. In short, my mother deliberately waited for the moment when I almost cracked and decided to act. Of course, no one was going to send their children, they were there for a long time, to the boarding school, including me. But getting on nerves for the sake of upbringing, well, actually, my mother succeeded, and my talent surprised her. At my small age, I knew how to think and embody what I thought was right, and so many adults were tricked by my intrigues as babies. The only thing I didn't have enough to become a good businesswoman, or maybe a politician, in the future was education. So, my mother said from that moment on, I would work at her firm. Of course, in my free time from school, and then I would go to university to pump up my skills. And then I had to work for the benefit of my family again. for the talent should be brought to light, and preferably for the benefit of the family. And in the evening, when all the papers had been already studied and sorted out, my mother and I returned home, and my bad actions fell on my head again. To begin with, I apologized to Danny and Chloe, not like the last time, but in a real way, with a detailed analysis of my and their actions, like, what you shouldn't do and what if. The girls got the idea and promised to learn to think with their own heads. Well, I thought they would definitely succeed, for without regular bullying at school and my intrigues, they had quite good potential for two. Then it was more difficult. I shook out my piggy bank and suffered a little over the fact that I was left without my money. And then I went to the pawn shop. Fortunately, the collection of William's cars hadn't been bought yet, and I managed to take everything, although the cunning seller demanded twice as much from me as he had paid. William was happy. His treasure had returned to him, and that's all. We lost our brother for the whole weekend. He was rubbing his cars, placing them by height and make, playing something there. Well, he was a boy, but he was happy and smiling again. And then I came to the school and realized that there were small bears before. The biggest difficulties were waiting for me ahead, and looked closely at me out of round glasses, out of Harry's eyes. I said goodbye. I actually made it clear to him that I didn't need him, and I needed him very much. But I thought that I no longer had any chances and right to communicate with him. As my sisters told me later, my strange communication with Harry was noticed by everyone. And they laughed, for we were circling around each other like dogs at garbage cans. But neither of us was ready to come nearer and talk. After all, the guys from the club and the twins were tired of looking at our gloomy faces. They caught us one by one, yelled at us, and then locked us in a classroom for club meetings. And they added that until we dealt with all our problems, we wouldn't be released. We had a quarrel. Well, because it all didn't work. If I or he had come to the negotiations by ourselves, and okay, but in such a way, instead of just apologizing or falling down on my knees and begging Harry for a fresh start, I thought it would be a great idea to yell at him and blame him for everything. Well, I yelled at him, and he yelled at me, and then we yelled at each other, calling each other names and remembering all the terrible things that had happened between us. But these insidious people who had locked us up refused to open the door anyway. And then I started talking, and this time I told him everything, and I told him about my own feelings, which I tried to fight. It was a shame. A couple of times I tried not to cry. Then again I started shouting at him and calling him a stupid deer. And after that, I sat at the nearest desk and started staring at the wall. And then I realized that I was being hugged, and for quite a long time, considering that Harry's t-shirt was wet from my tears. Romance, damn it. Apparently, I learned to fill the world with tears from the twins. Harry said that he had always believed in me, and he knew that I wasn't playing, that I just couldn't understand how I felt, and then I just tried to protect everyone from myself. In fact, I wasn't a monster, and it would be nice to let people decide for the future whether they wanted to protect themselves from me. We made up, and it was much more wonderful than all my revelations to myself, though it was completely illogical. Now we continue to learn and just live. Finally, the sisters stopped hiding from danger and started thinking. And given that there are two of them, and they are not planning to separate, the school will soon be in great turmoil because of changing the school authorities. William grew older as well and realized that he needs to be able to defend himself instead of relying on others. I taught him various necessary words and self-defense a bit. We haven't become friends, of course, but he is also cool, and he can be a good person if raised correctly. As my mother planned, I work at her firm as a kind of secretary. Mom sometimes even consults with me and always emphasizes that I am very good in such cases. It is a pleasure. Me and Harry have big plans for the future. He even tried to talk about a wedding a couple of times, but I reminded him that we are still children and first have to grow up and learn. Well, I feel certain that he'll succeed, for he's already being invited to all more or less famous universities. And I got one simple idea. You can prepare as much as you like that you don't care about people and play the part of the villain, but in reality, all villains only want one thing: to be loved. Subscribe to the channel. We still have a lot of interesting stories ahead.